Why do we watch horror movies? The horror genre is almost entirely centered around the examination of death. Whether it's a slasher film or a ghost story, death and the confrontation of its inevitability are arguably its defining feature. But like other literary and cinematic genres, horror is merely a catch-all for many different kinds of stories. For horror, these consist of ghost stories, slashers, psychological thrillers, and many more. Each one has evolved over time, often borrowing ideas from other genres while maintaining their core tropes and identities, mixing them into something new. An excellent example of genres shifting slightly over time while still maintaining their core identity is the Gothic horror story. Gothic horror has roots in many fables and tales from across the world. After all, scary stories being told around a campfire are probably as old as the human race itself. However, the Gothic stories as we know them today were first born in the 18th century. Over the last 200 plus years, the Gothic horror genre has evolved from mostly European ghost stories that took place in decrepit mansions and crumbling castles into something a bit more atmospheric and melancholy. The 2014 film A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night is maybe one of the greatest examples of a modern-day Gothic horror story, and one of my favorite films in the last decade. It's a film that ironically exists within the decaying bones of a genre that places most of its stories within crumbling castles of bygone ages, except instead of simply borrowing the tropes and settings of the Gothic stories of the past, it modernizes their themes and shadowy corridors, giving new life to the genre that inspired it. But what makes this Iranian-American vampire film truly great is not only how it breathes new life into a dormant cinematic subgenre, but how it highlights one of the more ignored features that makes Gothic media so appealing for so many people, myself included. Like in other horror stories, death is present and frightening, and it's meant to be a sobering reminder of our mortality, to not take ourselves too seriously. However, in addition to that, Gothic horror presents us with ruminations on life that express a kind of melancholic beauty alongside the horror. It's a feature of the subgenre that's equally comforting and simultaneously terrifying. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night is a Gothic Western fairy tale as described by its writer and director, Anna Lily Amapour. It tells the story of a place simply called Bad City, in which most of its residents do what they can to get by. Meanwhile, a lonesome vampire stalks the streets at night, draining her victims of blood. The most obvious connection to Gothic cinema is that the film is shot in black and white and has a vampire in it. The connection actually goes much deeper than that. Gothic horror was first born in the 18th century, but it didn't gain popularity until the 19th and 20th centuries. Gothic horror's defining features consist of supernatural elements, ruminations on life and death, and hints of romance. The subgenre gained popularity with the publication of classic stories like Dracula and Frankenstein, and eventually made its way into the world of film. In fact, Gothic cinema is almost as old as the medium itself. One of the first feature films ever made was a silent adaptation of Frankenstein. A few decades later, Dracula and Frankenstein would kick off the golden age of Universal horror, a block of films that borrowed heavily from Gothic literature and German expressionist films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night is an incredibly unique film for a number of reasons. Most notably, it's an American-made film created by and starring primarily Iranian-Americans. The actors all speak Farsi as opposed to English, and it was shot entirely in Los Angeles. The language, combined with the setting, give the film an ethereal quality not seen since the heyday of Universal's original horror universe. Films like Invisible Man and Frankenstein take place in an almost dreamlike Neverland that doesn't exist and never did exist. Likewise, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night also takes place in a world that seems to exist more as a metaphor rather than an actual location we would recognize. Metaphors run deep in Gothic literature and cinema. The primary lens through which we examine not only the characters of A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, but the setting itself is that of vampirism. Bad City itself is a vampire of sorts, draining the earth of oil and slowly killing it. The girl, as she's called since we never actually learn her name, is a literal vampire, killing people by drinking blood in order to survive. Saeed is a vampire of sorts to his community, selling drugs that ruin people's lives, stealing valuables, and exploiting others. Saeed also sells Arash's father the heroin he's hopelessly addicted to. The heroin is his own vampire, penetrating his skin and draining him of money, sanity, and life. It reminds me of that classic vampire trope where once someone has been bitten, they almost become beholden to their attacker, like Lucy in Dracula or Maggie in Dark Shadows. Arash's father also acts as a vampire to his own son, draining him of money to feed his addiction, and constantly attacking him for not being supportive of him. Even our protagonist has his faults. Arash steals items from the people he works for and sells drugs despite the fact his father is an addict. All of these factors combine to create an atmosphere where Bad City feels like a real place, a place where its denizens are unable to escape. A vampire city full of its own kind, in one way or another. It's a film that questions if there's such a thing as selflessness in a world where everyone is a kind of vampire to one another, and where the world itself drains them slowly of life. The characters seem unable to escape the grasp of the city and by proxy their situation. It's a dark place that isn't without its pleasures and moments of happiness, but overall, living in Bad City is a melancholic existence. It's a lot like life, which is why removing it from reality gives it the fairy tale quality it has, making it more relatable to the viewer no matter where they come from.
For me, the film is very, very personal. I think the things that happen in the film happen inside me, and they happen in all the places in the world that I've been to, which is loneliness, being misunderstood, wanting to find a connection, feeling isolated. I feel like there's a heaviness that lots of societies wear, and I don't really think it's a geographically specific thing. For me, it's a very, very personal thing. All the characters in the story, the way I see them, are isolated and grappling with something that keeps them away from other people and from themselves and from knowing what they want and figuring out how to get that. It's like really existential, personal kind of thing. But I feel like those things become universal when you go inside and harvest.
If I had to pick a primary emotion that I feel while watching this film, it would be melancholy. It's a film that I've thought a lot about in the last year, and made me really question what I love about Gothic media. Which brings me back to the question I asked at the beginning of this film, which is, why do we watch horror movies? But I think the question is more broad than that. Why do we watch movies in general? Why do we consume stories the way we do? Why watch something that makes you sad? I think for a lot of us the answer really depends. Like I discussed in my previous video about my love for the classic Universal horror films, there's something about Gothic media, specifically Gothic horror, that I find comforting, which is again weird when you consider that the entire genre is rooted in the examination of death. But I think Gothic media, and specifically Gothic films like this, go a little bit further. They not only show us death, but also the pain and the joy of being alive. Famous writer Victor Hugo once said that melancholy is the happiness of being sad. I think what he means is that there exists a kind of beauty in sadness, because without it, there couldn't be happiness in the first place.
Why do I love movies about fucked up people? Like, why do I love playing those parts so much? I think for me, I'm just the most interested in seeing a reflection of my darkness and things. Nothing makes me feel more comfortable and like less alone than seeing, seeing those sorts of stories and characters and feeling like that it's human.